My name is Ben Burgis, and I am the author of Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left, which is due out in just a few months from Zero Books. And I want to start out today talking about the Ad Hominem Fallacy, because if you hear people, certain left-wing spaces kind of mocking the very enterprise of caring very much about logical fallacies, this is the first one they'll go to. And the reason that this is the first one they'll go to is because there's a certain kind of internet idiot who loves to throw around the phrase ad hom. So if you say anything mean during an argument, if you insult or make fun of anybody during an argument, it is an ad hom. And I think it's worth making this distinction for a couple reasons. That one is just that this is a wildly inaccurate way of using this terminology. That is not, in fact, what the ad hominem logical fallacy is. The second is that there's this vicious cycle where, on the one hand, a certain kind of basement-dwelling, Ludwig von Mises admiring, race realist internet troll loves to throw around the names of logical fallacies in this very superficial way. It's like, oh, I see there are a lot of ad homs in that argument. And that in turn causes a lot of decent, well-meaning people to sort of, well, let's put it this way. Last month I was at a Chapo Trap House appearance in Princeton, about half an hour away from where I live in central New Jersey. And of course, as a bearded socialist dude in the tri-state area, I'm legally required to like Chapo Trap House. So they came and I went and, it was funny. But I want to play you just a minute that I immortalized from the Chapo event in Princeton to help illustrate what I'm talking about.
Logical fallacies are something nerds invented so that they can say time out in the middle of them being having their ass kicked.
All right, now, they're joking. Although, the extent to which it's a joke and the extent to which they kind of mean it, even though it's a joke, it's all very, it's all very murky, and that's the way a lot of comedy is, and that's fine. I'm not interested in unpacking, the exact degree to which they're joking, the exact degree to which they kind of mean it. But I think that they're giving, in that clip, a very pure expression to an attitude that I think is all too common among people I agree with politically. And the misuse of this term is really a big part of how that impression gets going. Because if you say, well, anytime you mock people, anytime you say anything mean to people, you're committing this logical fallacy, that creates the impression that logical fallacies and the effort to avoid logical fallacies have some function that's sort of approximately equivalent to the Marquis of Queensberry rules for boxing, that these are like the Marquis of Queensberry rules for gentlemanly debate. And of course, you'd say, oh, all right, I get why this certain sort of Ludwig von Mises admiring race realist internet troll would love these rules, that would be their whole thing. And those of us who are actually talking about and arguing about politics because we want to make the world a better place might not have a lot of time for them. And I think this is as wrong as wrong could be. And it's related to a couple of other errors about how we think about logic and good reasoning. So another very closely related mistake that people make is thinking that, okay, if you're talking a lot about logic, that must mean that you don't really want to talk about history or sociology, arguments like that. That what you're really interested in is applying some very small number of first principles in a very consistent way to every situation. And again, I think that's completely wrong. So a historical argument is an argument. A sociological argument is an argument. And like any other arguments, there can be good historical arguments and bad historical arguments, good sociological arguments and bad sociological arguments. And a lot of that, of course, has to do with the factual information and the premises of the argument, but a lot of it has to do with the reasoning itself. And this gets to why we should care about fallacies. So, I've said a few times now that the way that internet idiots use ad hominem is a misrepresentation of what the fallacy is. So I want to make good on that first before we go any further. So the ad hominem fallacy is the logical mistake that you make when you reject the conclusion of an argument or you reject the argument itself. You say there must be something wrong with the argument or even the conclusion because of some irrelevant fact or some irrelevant claim about the person making the argument. So, if somebody were to say Richard Spencer supports single-payer health care, therefore it's a bad reactionary idea, that's committing the ad hominem fallacy. And it's actually a pretty rare thing. Sometimes people do it. It's worth avoiding it. It's worth being careful to avoid it. But given that this is probably the single most frequently leveled accusation of fallacious reasoning on social media, it's remarkable how little it's actually used. So, because easily 95% of the things that people on social media say are ad homs are not. For one thing, you can insult somebody or mock somebody without committing a logical fallacy of any kind. Now, it might or might not be a good idea or productive or kind or conducive to having an interesting discussion afterwards or any of those things to mock or insult somebody, but it's not committing a logical fallacy. Only an argument can commit a logical fallacy. If you're not making an argument, there is no fallacy there. Many of us go through our entire day saying things that are not arguments, and if you're Stefan Molyneux, you think that that's a problem, not an argument, but the rest of us should know better. Okay, and that's one thing. Another thing is that very often when people are accused of ad homs, it's because they're bringing up some relevant information that genuinely undermines the trustworthiness of the source. If there are 995 other studies on global climate change that come to one conclusion, and the 996th study that comes to a strikingly different conclusion was funded by the Koch brothers Institute for Combating Environmental Chicken Littleism, then that information about the funding is relevant. Not necessarily decisive, should still look at the study and all that, but it gives us legitimate reasons to distrust the source. And this is a really important point because whether or not some fallacy is in play or not is something that you can't just read off of a quick scan of the words that somebody's used, right? Like if you've typed out a 280 character message on Twitter trying to make an argument or encapsulate an argument as best you can on that horribly limited medium, and 3 seconds later somebody writes back, oh, you're committing this fallacy and that fallacy, you should distrust those judgments because it's not that easy. You can't just read it off a superficial scan of the words that are being used. You have to actually think about it. So if what we're interested in is not just being good at debate in the sense of being loud and fast and confident, and don't get me wrong, I wish that a lot of my fellow leftists cared more about those rhetorical skills too. Rhetoric is also a valuable and important thing. But if what we're interested in is being good at reasoning, then when we look at these patterns of bad reasoning, these logical fallacies, learning their names is easy, but the skill that we actually want to cultivate is thinking carefully about whether the argument that we're looking at actually commits it or not. So, something that might look like an ad hominem, if you make that quick, thoughtless, snap judgment, might be a perfectly good reason to have a reduced level of confidence in the epistemic reliability of the source that you're looking at. Something that somebody might make a snap judgment is an appeal to authority might be a particularly, perfectly legitimate appeal to expert opinion. You have to actually look at the details and think about it. And, okay, does this person actually have some piece of relevant knowledge about the particular issue we're talking about here that the rest of us don't have? If so, it's not committing the appeal to authority fallacy. It's a perfectly legitimate appeal to expert opinion. Even when it comes to flat-out logical inconsistency, there's a way of thinking about it that I think is how the basement-dwelling, Ludwig von Mises-loving, race-realist internet trolls think about it, and what a lot of good Chapo-loving socialist people who want a better world are overreacting to. That there's one way of thinking about logical inconsistency that's like that, and there's another way of thinking about it that's much more useful. So I want to use one quick illustration of that before we wrap up the video. Think about conservative and libertarian arguments about anti-union right-to-work laws. So, right-to-work laws are laws dictating that in businesses or in certain sorts of businesses, you can't have a closed shop. In other words, you can't have a business where all of the employees, as a condition of employment, have to join the union. Of course, actual labor laws for quite some time in general in the United States haven't really allowed for that, contrary to popular mythology. But that distinction is not really going to be relevant for the point that I want to make here. So right-to-work laws are laws that say you can't have to join a union as a condition of employment, and you can't even do what, pre-Janus, a lot of public employees were able to negotiate in their contracts, which is to say, okay, if you don't want to join the union, that's your prerogative, but since the union still has to represent you, you can be required to, if you don't want to join, to pay a smaller agency fee that can't be used for political purposes, but will be used for the union to negotiate on your behalf and represent you if you have a grievance, and so on and so forth. All right, now, an easy point to make, and when I say it's easy, I'm not saying it's not worthwhile to make. I think it's very much worthwhile to make because as far as I can tell, about 99.5% of conservatives and especially libertarians who love right-to-work laws haven't thought about this, is that given the way that conservatives and especially libertarians normally talk about rights and freedom, right-to-work laws are just flatly inconsistent with their stated values about rights and freedoms. So normally these guys would say, hey, if you don't like something about your workplace, if there's something about the conditions for employment that you don't like, if your employer says that all employees have to wear a certain uniform and you find that uniform demeaning, these guys will say, hey, if you don't like it, just go work somewhere else. In fact, they would say that if the government got involved in telling employers what they could or couldn't require their employees to do, that would be oppression. That would be unfreedom, because according to these guys, or in most contexts according to these guys, freedom is freedom of contract. Okay, but wait a second. If freedom is freedom of contract, and it's not, you're not being oppressed by your employer having some demanding or demeaning or demoralizing conditions for employment, what would be oppressive is if they weren't allowed to require whatever the hell they wanted to require, then why are stipulations in employment contracts requiring even, let's say, full union membership not covered under this general rubric? That's inconsistent. There's an important caveat to make here, which is that before you accuse somebody of inconsistency, you should ask, especially when it comes to something like this, oh, you support this, but you don't support this. That's inconsistent. Since there's a smart way to do that and a not so smart way to do that, so you want to make sure that you're doing it the better way. So what I mean by that is that you should ask yourself the question, okay, is this really a case of logical inconsistency, or is this just a case of a balancing act between competing values? Mistaking competing values for inconsistency is a rookie mistake. Don't do that. So it's not inconsistent, for example, for somebody with democratic socialist views who abhors American imperialism to support Bernie Sanders against Hillary Clinton in the 2016 primary, partially because of her vote to invade Iraq, but then to turn around and say, okay, well, reluctantly, the right thing to do in the general election, now that Hillary's won the primary, is to hold your nose and put on some rubber gloves and pull that lever for Hillary, at least if you're in a swing state, because Trump would be so much worse. And somebody could say, aha, you're being inconsistent. I thought that the war in Iraq was really bad, and that was a good reason to vote for somebody who hadn't voted for it against somebody who had voted for it. And Donald Trump was at least he made some very unclear statements in the run-up to the war in Iraq, but it's not totally clear that he was actually against it in any meaningful way. In fact, some of the interviews before the war, he sort of sounded like he didn't care one way or the other. But he wasn't in the Senate. He didn't vote for or against it, and he made some mildly critical comments. So you think, okay, on Iraq, Trump is better than Clinton. So you, a Democratic socialist who made a big deal about Iraq in the primary, are being inconsistent for voting for Hillary in the general election. And of course, that's a nonsense argument, because it's perfectly consistent to say, hey, we have multiple values and we have to balance them against each other and make what may be a difficult judgment call in different situations. And of course, the war in Iraq vote is a huge reason to abhor Hillary Clinton, to prefer somebody else in the primary. But given everything that's at stake in the general election and about Donald Trump's white nationalist adjacent politics, it made perfect sense to say, okay, suck it up and reluctantly vote for Hillary in swing states. So before we accuse conservatives or libertarians of logical inconsistency, we should make sure we're not making that same mistake here. We're not mixing up competing moral or political goals being balanced against each other for logical inconsistency. So could it be that maybe from a conservative or libertarian perspective, unions, workers getting together and having a little bit of power at the workplace and being able to get higher wages and having a little bit of basic dignity, so they're not worried all the time that if their immediate supervisor doesn't like them, they'll get fired, and all of the other god-awful things that are true about anti-unionized workplaces. Maybe from a conservative or libertarian perspective, unions are so terrible that even though right-to-work laws are a restriction on freedom, it's worthwhile anyway. That's one possible interpretation of their stance, and even though, of course, that would be a morally odious, bizarre stance from the perspective of somebody like me, those are the values of a space alien, and one of the aliens from Aliens, maybe, not like a nice space alien like E.T. But in any case, it wouldn't be inconsistent if that's what they were saying. But the thing is, it's not what they're saying, and the reason that you can tell it's not what they're saying is this part. That they're not saying, hey, here are these necessary laws to make it harder for workers to unionize because unions are such terrible things that it's worth taking a hit on our value of freedom to have our value of union busting be better served by it. No, they're actually being inconsistent because they're selling this as a right. But of course, their conception of rights, their conception of freedom is freedom of contract between employees and employers, unhindered by government interference. Well, in this case, if to settle a strike, for example, in those negotiations, the employer agree to a closed shop provision in the contract, then by those libertarian principles, that is freedom. And the government stepping in, restricting it, is unfreedom. So, they're being inconsistent about this. This point has been made by many people. Nathan Robinson has an excellent article about it in Current Affairs. Nathan's stuff is always good. If I had one criticism of the Nathan Robinson article, it's that he doesn't really, in more than a cursory way, ask an important follow-up question. Okay, given that conservatives and libertarians are being inconsistent about right to work, because they would normally say that if you don't like the employment contract, that's not, if there's an employment contract saying you have to do this at work and not this, or to be employed here you have to do this thing and not this other thing, that's not restricting your right to do that thing or the other thing. If you want to do something else, just go work somewhere else. Well, okay, if they're being inconsistent, are we also being inconsistent? Because this gets down to the point that I was making before about how there's a smarter and a less smart way to think about accusations of inconsistency. And this goes right back to the issue of whether you see the rules of good reasoning and avoiding certain forms of bad reasoning as something like the Marquis of Queensberry rules for gentlemanly debate, or whether you see it as something else that might be a lot more worthwhile than that. So if you just see logic as a sort of tool for point scoring, and look, I know some of these videos have titles like, Ben Burgis destroys this, that, and the other thing. I don't make the titles. I'm okay with them. I think Doug, my editor, is having a little bit of fun with me when he makes some of those because he knows that in the book I talk about how this is a bad way to think about what we do with logic, to think about it as destroying things, that's not really the point. But, that's okay. I'm okay, at least in titles, with speaking to YouTube in the language of YouTube. But I want to get to this issue of what's the better way to think about it. Because if it's just a matter of point scoring, then you don't really worry about that question. Oh, wait a second, am I also being inconsistent? Because see, I got him, right? I win. But if you see it as something else, you should be worried about that second question, does this critique also apply just as well to me? So, because this is very often when people do see arguments as a matter of point scoring, they don't worry about this. So, for example, when Democrats correctly accuse Republicans of hypocrisy for having accused Obama of being too soft on Russia, and then having a totally different attitude towards the Russia issue under Trump. They don't pause to ask themselves, well, wait a second, but doesn't that mean that centrist pro-Obama Democrats are also being inconsistent in having downplayed the Russia thing when Mitt Romney in 2012 said that Russia was a huge threat, and reversing course now? So we as serious leftists don't want to make the same mistake here. Just sort of treating this as a matter of point scoring, lobbing the accusation of inconsistency, and then not wondering whether it's a two-edged sword. Because, look, conservatives and libertarians would say in other contexts, hey, if you're required by an employment contract to do X, but you want to do not X, your right to do not X isn't being hindered, just go work somewhere else. But we as leftists, as socialists, we wouldn't say that. We would mock that line of reasoning. We would say, yeah, okay, that is a totally worthless conception of freedom. It doesn't actually address the kind of substantive autonomy that human beings have any reason to care about. That sure, you don't have to work at that particular workplace, but if realistically, since most of us can't go into business for ourselves, right, getting together to start our capital is hard. The vast majority of small businesses fail in the first year. Ordinary people who try to start small businesses are risking much more than wealthy investors. So given that there are only so many lifeboats out of the working class, most people who start out in the working class stay in the working class, no matter how much they might, how hard they might work at social mobility. So given those brute sociological facts, we say, well, that doesn't mean very much to say that you could go work for somebody else, especially when the other jobs are going to be the same way. That it's not like, hey, if you don't want to be dominated by this boss, you can go be dominated by that boss. But it's going to be the same. Capitalist employment is going to be the same deal everywhere. I mean, that point that I just made is the heart of at least one way of thinking about the Marxist critique of capitalism. It's not the whole thing, but it's an important part of it. Okay, so normally we would say that workers' substantive autonomy, their ability to lead their lives however they want to lead them, is undermined by certain things being made conditions of employment, and that the government stepping in to give workers more options through various sorts of social democratic reforms is an expansion of freedom, and that expropriating the means of production, distribution, etc. altogether and putting them under workers' control would be an even greater, more dramatic expansion of human freedom. So from our perspective, are we being inconsistent when we oppose right-to-work laws? Because, hey, these laws are stepping in to give workers a certain kind of choice. Join a union, don't join a union, or even pay the agency fee, don't pay the agency fee that they wouldn't have otherwise. So are we being equally inconsistent? I don't think so. So this complicated stuff, and I'm not going to be able to do justice to this in the next minute, but just to gesture at it, I think a good read of the way that Marx and Engels and a lot of subsequent socialists talk about freedom, that's the normative concept that's most important to Marx. He talks about freedom. He's way more interested in freedom than he is in equality. And the way that Marx talks about freedom, I think is fairly well described in what some philosophers and political theorists call the Republican conception of liberty. That's the Republican conception of liberty, like the Roman Republic, not like a certain extremely unsavory force in contemporary American politics. But the Republican conception of liberty basically says that the kind of freedom that proponents of this theory care most about is a certain kind of freedom from domination by others. And this is the kind of conception that you have to be equally concerned with private regimes of domination as ones that directly go through the state. Given this, I think that it is actually consistent to say that all else being equal, when we're looking at any given situation in which some law is going to be able to stop employers from regulating the behavior of their employees in certain ways, that's going to be an expansion of freedom in this sense. But when it comes to the right to work case, that's a little bit more complicated. And the reason it's a little bit more complicated is that in one way, the substantive autonomy of the worker, the degree to which they can do whatever they want with their lives, unhindered by the domination of others, which of course, by the way, nobody thinks that it's possible to absolutely overcome all forms of domination by others, maybe short of, going off to live in the woods so you don't interact with anybody else. But something doesn't have to be absolutely realizable to be an important value. So just to put that objection to one side. I think you could accept that there is a degree to which, a very small degree to which, in this particular case, right, the freedom of the worker to decide how they want to live their lives is, in this tiny way, being undermined. That, all right, there's a certain very, very tiny percentage of the paycheck that's going to the agency fee or union dues or not. In that they don't get to decide that, the worker's freedom is curtailed. Less seriously curtailed, I would say, than laws saying that you can only drive, on the right side of the road. You can't just switch over to drive British style on the left side of the road whenever the spirit takes you. But in a very small way, yes. But of course, even before we bring in other values we might weigh freedom against, even in terms of freedom, if you have this Republican conception of liberty, what you have to say is, okay, what's the overall extent to which the worker is able to control their own lives? Is this a net increase or a net decrease? Well, we look at the question of, okay, are they in control of where this tiny percentage of their paycheck goes? No, they're not. In that sense, maybe they're in a little bit less control. Now, we look at questions like if their supervisor asks them, hey, can you work a few minutes late today? And you really want to say no, or that your kids are expecting you, whatever. Are you going to say, yes, sure, I'll work a few minutes late because you're afraid of the consequences, or are you going to go with your first preference and say, no, I'm going to get home to my kids? If you want to get a tattoo, are you afraid, maybe my boss won't like this, or does the union contract go into great detail about what you can and can't be fired for, and thus protect your right to get that tattoo? If you want to go to a political protest, well, at a non-unionized workplace, you have to be a lot more worried that if your boss doesn't like your politics, you might get fired for being seen at that protest. And even if there are laws theoretically protecting you, realistically, most labor laws are a hell of a lot more enforced at unionized workplaces than non-unionized workplaces. So, I think it's perfectly consistent from a left-wing perspective to say, yeah, we have this better and more plausible conception of freedom from the perspective of which it is a net increase in individual freedom, not to mention collective bargaining power, for workers to have the right to push and contract for negotiations for provisions requiring closed shops. All right, last point. Why do we care about all this? Why do we care about logical inconsistency? Why do we care about avoiding logical fallacies short of outright inconsistency? Well, I said earlier that we should care about something besides being good at debate, in that rhetorical sense. Rhetoric is great, learn rhetoric, but what I'm selling is a little bit different. What I'm pushing isn't being good at debate, it's being good at reasoning. And we should care about avoiding inconsistency. We should care about making sure that we're not arguing in fallacious ways, not because of it's part of some prissy and arbitrary set of rules for honorable debate, not because of anything like that. It's because if we're good at reasoning, we're more likely to get things right. And if we care a lot about trying to figure out, for example, how we should act politically in accordance with our underlying values, then getting it right is something that should matter.
Thanks for watching this Zero Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zero Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zero Books Book Club and help us to continue making online content from the left.